Hey girls, it's Sunday afternoon. Today is actually, I'm a whole stinking week behind. Today is actually 2 weeks behind, I guess. I'm getting ready to do session 6 and try to get caught up. I should have recorded this last week. And I don't know what it is about time and getting older, but I sure am not very efficient with it anymore. But today's lesson is we find ourselves in the 8th chapter of Proverbs. We're working on wisdom. Now we know that Solomon had asked God for wisdom as his gift whenever he became king after his father David in the Old Testament. Now we also know that the book of Proverbs is like a textbook, more or less, that was written for princes and for it's written to Solomon's son and sons, and primarily like in school. And so there's an opportunity here for us to be in school as well. So here we find ourselves in the 8th chapter. All our background passages are chapter 8 verses 1 through chapter 9 verses 18. And the title of today's lesson is Pursuing Wisdom. It's something we got to ask for, and then we got to go pursue it. We've kind of had talking about some charted waters. We've talked about the directions that are offered. We each get that opportunity. How compassion is demonstrated. And then we talk about the choice. We all have a choice of which road we're going to take. And then last week we talked about, or session 5, we talked about following God's design for husband and wife. And now today I'm going to talk a little bit about pursuing some wisdom. So we know that God promises to provide his wisdom to those who search for him. Wisdom may be defined sometimes as the appropriate application of knowledge. So in any given situation, we sort through what we know and seek to select the information that is relevant to our circumstances right then. According to the book of Proverbs now, true knowledge comes from an understanding of God's nature and then our human frailty. Wisdom rests upon these same truths. So, hence, the acquisition of both knowledge and wisdom begins with seeking God. That's where the rubber meets the road for us. That's what we're going to talk about today. As Solomon emphasized in the Bible passage for this session, God promises to provide his wisdom to those who search for him. We got to ask him for it. So God offers wisdom by which to live life and to glorify him on a daily basis. Sometimes for me it's on a minute-by-minute basis. He has revealed himself in nature, in his written word, and in Jesus. So even though God's taken the step to reveal his wisdom, God's people cannot be passive when it comes to pursuing it. He reveals his wisdom now, and simultaneously we must pursue the revealed wisdom of God. Our pursuit is critical to our spiritual maturity and our growth in that sanctification process. Now, our background, we talk about Proverbs chapters 1 through chapter 9. So far, we've been studying, this will be our 6th lesson in the book of Proverbs. This forms a literary unit in which Solomon addresses his sons. He admonished them as young adults to continue behaving the way of wisdom that their parents had taught them. Some of Solomon's instructions were general in nature. For example, the counsel to avoid wicked companions. We find that in chapter 1. Some instructions were more specific, such as the warning to shun adultery in chapter 6 and chapter 7. Still, other teachings were graphic and well-designed and defined, such as the danger of seducing a married woman. That's chapter 7, while other sections are more poetic and figurative in chapter 5. So within this last category are passages in which abstract ideas such as wisdom, are described through the literary device of personification. In Hebrew thought, however, personification was not necessarily meant to make a pagan idol out of an attribute. Rather, it meant to explain the one true God's infinite and perfect nature in understandable human terms. In other words, bringing it down to earth for us. True wisdom, in other words, was from God, but yet was practical. It was and is worthy of searching for. So in today's lesson, chapter 8, Solomon again uses personification in discussing godly wisdom in Proverbs chapter 8, verses 1 through 9, chapter 9, verse 18. So in chapter 8, the first 5 verses, he describes wisdom as a vendor hawking her wares in the marketplace. In chapter 8, verses 6 through 21, he recounted her sales pitch for acquiring wisdom. The passage clearly reveals the advantage of acquiring wisdom. Now in chapters 22 through 31, it establishes the antiquity of wisdom. The passage opens with this assertion that the Lord already possessed wisdom at the beginning of creation. Indeed, wisdom preceded creation. It was, and in fact, the fundamental principle and pattern for the design for creation. So Proverbs 8, verses 32 through 36, then lays out wisdom's plea for God's people to choose wisdom as their way of life. Wisdom states that listening to her appeal makes one happy. Listening implies more than just hearing the sounds of her entreaty. One must live as she instructs. So in living in accordance with wisdom's teaching generates the best life possible for each individual within the constraints of God's will for his or her life. So in Hebrew language, the word for love and hate had the sense of choosing and rejecting, respectively. So hence, to reject wisdom is to choose death. In Proverbs, then, in chapters 9, the first 18 verses, Solomon sets up this contrast between wisdom's entreaty that leads to life and the call of folly or foolishness that leads to death. Wisdom is described as inviting people to a banquet in her house. The house is strong and it's spacious. The table is set with life-giving food and drink. Folly, on the other hand, she's at a booth down at the Burger King. It's like this boisterous woman. She's preying on naive individuals passing by her house. Those who agree to her solicitation end up in Sheol, or in hell, the place of the dead. So the point's clear. Choose wisdom. And don't be fooled, ladies. It is always a choice. So let's read our verses. I'm coming to y'all from the front porch because it's too daggum hot on the back porch this afternoon to do any kind of recording. Starting in verses 6 of chapter 8, Solomon's portraying God's wisdom here. Verse 6, listen, for I speak of noble things, and what my lips say is right. Verse 7, for my mouth tells the truth, and wickedness is detestable to my lips. All the words from my mouth are righteous. None of them are deceptive or perverse. All of them are clear to the perceptive and right to those who discover knowledge. Verse 10, accept my instruction instead of silver, and knowledge rather than pure gold. Verse 11, for wisdom is better than jewels, and nothing desirable can equal it. Verse 12, I'll talk about how powerful this is. Verse 12, I, wisdom, share a home with shrewdness, and have knowledge and discretion. Verse 13, to fear the Lord is to hate evil. I hate arrogant pride, evil conduct, and perverse speech. Verse 14, I possess good advice and sound wisdom. I have understanding and strength. It is by me that kings reign and rulers enact just law. By me, princes lead, as do nobles and all righteous judges. Then we move on to verses 17. I love those who love me, and those who search for me find me. Verse 18, with me are riches and honor, lasting wealth and righteousness. Verses 19, my fruit is better than solid gold, and my harvest better than pure silver. Verses 20 and 21, I walk in the ways of righteousness, along the paths of justice, giving wealth as an inheritance to those who love me, filling their treasuries. So those are our verses for today's lesson. So let's back up a little bit and talk about each of these groups of verses. We're going to talk about how valuable wisdom, the search and the pursuit of wisdom is. Now, Solomon's portraying God's wisdom as perfect and as righteous in every way. So God's wisdom is more valuable than any precious metal or any gemstone. Verse 6, listen, for I speak of noble things, and what my lips say is right. For my lips tell the truth, and wickedness is detestable to my lips. Verse 8, all the words from my mouth are righteous, and none of them are deceptive or perverse. And verse 9, all of them are clear to the perceptive, and right to those who discover knowledge. So these verses 6 through 9, Solomon called to his students now to listen. He's saying to them, for I speak of noble things, and what my lips say is right. He repeatedly called his students to sit up, to take notice, to listen, to adhere to what he was saying. It's like he keeps getting their attention. You know, Solomon was focused on calling God's people to pay attention because he knew that sinful man's attention span is short. We all need continual reminders to pursue the things of God. Further, Solomon's instructions were right because they were from God. Therefore, he wrote, my mouth tells the truth, and wickedness is detestable to my lips. Solomon's encouraged the pursuit of wisdom of God by reminding God's people that his instructions were righteous. None of them are deceptive or perverse. In other words, Solomon was not attempting to deceive anyone here, but was passing along these great principles and these precepts of God's truth as the most valuable things in all the world. Sin obscures the obvious, the true and what's truly beautiful. Wisdom removes the fog of ignorance. I like that. Solomon reminded God's people that God's teachings of wisdom are clear to the perceptive. Now look here, that means you got to be perceptive for it to be clear to the perceptive. So you've got to be perceptive. And right to those who discover knowledge. So in other words, we've got to pursue the wisdom of God. We've got to pursue God's knowledge. We've got to discover it. Verse 10, accept my instruction instead of silver, and knowledge rather than pure gold, for wisdom is better than jewels, and nothing desirable can equal. So here in these two verses, Solomon's portrayed God's wisdom as more valuable than any earthly acclaim. He declared that godly wisdom is more valuable than silver or gold and is better than jewels. In fact, nothing desirable can equal it. More than wealth, more than power, more than notoriety, the pursuit of the wisdom of God is the most valuable commodity in an otherwise materialistic world. Don't we need a big old bucket full of it right now? What's going on in our world today, in our country today. Solomon turned things on their head by placing the value of the pursuit of wisdom above all other pursuits. Solomon's admonition here to pursue first God's wisdom was foreshadowing of Jesus' call for his followers to seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness over in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 6, verse 33. Because wisdom is valuable, it must be pursued with great passion and persistence. When God's wisdom is pursued first, all the other issues of life tend to become more manageable and more understandable. They all kind of fall into their rightful place. So then we're going to learn that this pursuit of wisdom is powerful. Solomon declared God's wisdom as residing in those who fear God. So wisdom empowers God and provides for justice. Verse 12, I, wisdom, He's talking in the first person now. Share a home with shrewdness and have knowledge and discretion. Godly wisdom is astute and it's resourceful. During the Israelites' conquest of Canaan, the citizens of Gibeon recognized that their destruction was inevitable if they opposed the Israelite army. So therefore, the Gibeonites' representatives described themselves as members of this distant people, willing to enter into this covenant with the Israelites. So their misrepresentation to save their own skin later resulted in the Gibeonites becoming becoming slaves to the Israelites. Yet their behavior was seen as shrewd at the time because it saved their people from annihilation. So verse 13 says, to fear the Lord is to hate evil. I hate arrogant pride, evil conduct, and perverse speech. Verse 14, I possess good advice and sound wisdom. I have understanding and strength. Verse 15 and 16, it is by me that kings reign and rulers enact just law. By me princes lead, as do nobles and all righteous judges. So we're finding here in verses 12 through 16 that fearing God puts a person on the path to being wise. To fear the Lord means to revere, to respect, to trust, to submit to. Fearing God in this way is the difference between growing wise or becoming foolish. So having the wisdom of God means that what he loves and detests, we love and detest. So for that reason, everyone who values his wisdom will hate evil. Opposite side of the coin. So to hate evil is to hate arrogant pride. It's to hate evil conduct, and it's to hate perverse speech. So God's wisdom gives believers an option that goes against the evil we see in the world. God will give his wisdom when we study his word, when we go to him in prayer, and when we seek the advice of mature believers in Christ. The understanding that we gain can enable us to make sound judgments. So strengthened by God's wisdom, we won't be overwhelmed when we're faced with circumstances that seem daunting to us. There is no greater power in the world than the knowledge of God. So Solomon stated that these 4 truths are going to help us understand the power of God's wisdom. Number 1, God's wisdom possesses good advice. God's wisdom is sound. God's wisdom gives people understanding, and then God's wisdom gives people strength. In other words, God's wisdom equips his people with sound reason, clear thinking, sufficient knowledge, endurance, perseverance, patient strength, and faith. Oh Lord, for a bucket of all of that right now. In verses 15 and 16, then Solomon goes on. He seems to become almost autobiographical here, as if reflecting on his own experiences as king. God's wisdom, and when he adhered to it, was the very thing that gave him his success. Solomon recognized that God's wisdom impacts all of the functions of government. Can I get a witness? Solomon recognized that God's wisdom impacts all of the functions of government, of a free and orderly society. There is wisdom for the executive and kings who reign. There is wisdom for the legislative and the just law. And there's wisdom for the judicial in recognizing righteous judges. So Solomon desired to show the power of God's wisdom by demonstrating how it applied to every dimension of life, even to leading a nation. So we know that God's wisdom comes through fearing him. His wisdom enables leaders to govern nations. Therefore, it is more than sufficient for the problems of any of us individual believers today. It's also obtainable. God's wisdom is obtainable. When we pursue it, when we seek it, we're going to find it. Solomon promised that the person seeking God's wisdom would find it. The person who lives by God's wisdom will experience God's blessings, including the avoidance of self-destructive patterns. In verse 17, we read, I love those who love me, and those who search for me find me. Much of the language in the ritual of the Old Testament stressed the vast difference between a holy God and sinful humanity. Huge gap. God was said to be enthroned between the cherubim, a reference to the mercy seat of the Ark of the Covenant. So in Old Testament times, only the high priests could enter this Holy of Holies where the Ark was kept. He could enter only on one day, that Day of Atonement, and then only after carefully purifying himself through sacrifices and offerings. So consequently, one might conclude that the average believer had little hope of ever relating personally to the Lord. But in this verse, wisdom insists that those who seek God will find him. So those who choose to search for godly wisdom will not be disappointed. You're not going to come up empty-handed. When you go to the market of wisdom, you be sure and take a basket, because you're going to bring back a basket full. This second line promises that those who actively search for wisdom will surely find it. The two lines of this verse are an example of this synopsis of this parallelism, in which the second line repeats the first line using alternative words. So in other words, both lines have the same meaning. Wisdom is available to those who desire it. Since wisdom is an attribute of God, those who love and search for wisdom also love and search for God. Wisdom can be obtained simply by asking God for it in earnestness. However, this request has got to be made in faith, that God can and will give the petitioner this wisdom. So unlike petitions that may not conform to God's plans, the petition for wisdom harmonizes with the very nature of God. It is a desire for God himself and a wish to know him better. So God will not fail to give us believers the wisdom that we seek. To pursue the wisdom of God is to pursue God's written word. And that's why it's so important to study the Bible. That's why it's so important for us to hang together, girls, for us to work on these lessons together, because this is where the wisdom is. This is where God is revealing it to us. But if we don't open those pages, if we don't open that book, if it's just a paperweight on our nightstands, it's never going to get in, and we're never going to glean it in our hearts, like Shirley says. So verse 18, with me are riches and honor, lasting wealth and righteousness. So this verse is just another example of synonymous parallelism. Riches and lasting wealth, they refer to the same concept. Now, wisdom can enable an individual to attain material goods, but not all wisdom as benefits are material. In fact, a lot of times it's just the other way around. The verses also name honor and righteousness as benefits to wisdom. So the essence of this verse is that wisdom's benefits can be material and spiritual. Verse 19 says, my fruit is better than silver and solid gold, and my harvest is purer than silver. So gold and silver were common mediums for commerce back then. The term solid and pure describes that these two metals in their purest and their most desirable condition, their universal value, same today, enables the purchase of virtually any commodity in any location. So whereas in a bartered situation, a buyer might not need what the seller had to offer in trade, such a problem would disappear now if one of those traders had gold or silver. It changes the whole transaction. Yet the fruit and harvest of wisdom outclassed even these possessions of these purest metals. So when material wealth becomes the sole objective of one's life, it corrupts that individual and causes him or her to miss out on what is truly valuable. So verse 20 and 21, I walk in the ways of righteousness along the paths of justice. Now this is in the first person. Solomon's writing as if wisdom herself is speaking. I walk in the ways of righteousness along the paths of justice, giving wealth as an inheritance to those who love me and filling their treasuries. So adhering to the principles of wisdom is preferable to schemes for gaining wealth fraudulently. The pursuit of wisdom always adheres to God's established principles and his values. So these principles and values are spelled out clearly in the Bible. The persistent study of the Scripture will disclose them reliably. Like a path created by generations of walking along on that same route, the ways of righteousness never vacillate. They have been well established. Wisdom produces a way of life that holds to ethical behavior and impartiality. So verses 18 through 21, if the wisdom of God is valuable, powerful, and obtainable, then what is gained when the believer pursues and embraces God's wisdom about everything else? Well, now in these verses, Solomon outlined this reward and the benefits of pursuing God's wisdom. What's remarkable about the wisdom of God is that it is comprehensive in its impact. His wisdom makes people rich in the things of God. God's wisdom enables people to live in honor. His wisdom gives people lasting wealth that does not fade. God's wisdom offers people his righteousness. God's wisdom is better than solid gold. God's wisdom is more valuable than pure silver. God's wisdom enables people to walk in the ways of righteousness. God's wisdom calls people to move along the paths of justice. And then again, God's wisdom provides an inheritance to the godly. So the wisdom of pursuing wealth that lasts. Got several verses here I wanted to share with y'all because you just can't get enough scripture. Proverbs 8:18. With me are riches and honor, lasting wealth and righteousness. Proverbs 11, chapter 11, verse 7. Hope placed in wealth vanishes. Proverbs 13, verse 11. Wealth obtained by fraud will dwindle, and then wealth is not forever. Proverbs 27:24. A greedy one is in a hurry for wealth. He doesn't know that poverty will come to him. Proverbs 28:22. Don't store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasure in heaven. Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 and 20. And then finally, my final verse, 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 17. Instruct those who are rich in the present age not to be arrogant or to set their hope on the uncertainty of wealth, but on God. So girls, we've got quite a pursuit on our hands. At our ages, we're starting to see a little bit of it. We can turn around, we can look over our shoulder at a bunch of young women coming up behind us that are looking to us for that hand down to that rung, up to the next rung, to help them along their path of sanctification. The wisdom of God is rare objectivity and it's rare stability, and we need to ask for it and we need to seek it every day of our lives. And those days become more precious to me at my age, and the older I get, this every day with Jesus is sweeter than the day before is true. Now, I hope you all have a good day. I'm going to try to get around and try to get you caught up. But it doesn't look like, but about 2 people have looked at my last one. So they're going to be a test here pretty soon. Love you, girls. Pray for our country on both knees. We're going to pray and we're going to kneel to God and we're going to stand for the American flag. All right, girls. Patty out.